So my name is Mitun Zavery. I run the pre-sales team or solution architecture team. One sounds more like a person you don't want to speak to, and one sounds more like a person you probably want to speak to. But realistically, it's actually the solution engineering team for Sonatype within my organization. So I'm here to talk to you today about automated die. It's been a theme that a lot of people have talked about for years, right? So what am I going to teach you that's any different, right? So hopefully you will pick up some facts from here, and you will sort of learn something new about what we do within the organization. So this gentleman, who in the room has heard of Edward Deming? Okay, so quite a few people. So 1945, Edward Deming effectively reinvented or created what was effectively called the TQM process. So it was the supply chain for automotive parts and car parts. And he talked about several principles that made efficiencies in this. And obviously back in that time, Toyota then became one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world. And Ford and BMW and Mercedes all adopted that process in their own way, right, using some of the principles of Edward Deming. So why am I talking about Edward Deming? Why am I talking about what he achieved back in the 1940s? And we're here about security and software, right? What relationships do they have? Well, actually, Edward Deming talked about various principles, things like don't pass defects downstream, okay? What does that mean? Picking the best suppliers, right? Picking the best vendors of those best suppliers. In the world we are at the moment, manufacturing may be a thing of the past or maybe modernized right now. Now software is that supply chain, okay? So if you think about software as a supply chain, these are the same principles that we learned and sort of taught ourselves back in the 1940s that are now being used today within most organizations, right? Whether it be a large enterprise or whether it be a software vendor or a software organization. Jez Humble, 2010, he talked about quality, right? And doing this in a continuous way, okay? Again, some of the same principles that we are using today and a lot of organizations are striving to achieve. 2013, Gene Kim, the same concept, right? We understand that there were three ways of DevOps from what Gene Kim wrote about. Obviously, the Unicorn Project is one of his latest books as well. But again, it's about automation, agile, right? Building quality into your software development process. And by building automation inside of your software development process or your LM process, you have the ability to deploy multiple times, in that process, right? Jez Humble talked about all pause, 10 deploys a day, okay? 47% of individuals or organizations, right, that we know of, deploy multiple times per week, right? Everyone is striving to deploy faster, push out new features, new releases, security patches, right? And so we need velocity for that. And from obviously the DevSecOps community survey that we run every year, 47% of those people would deploy multiple times a week, okay? But that seems like a fairly small number, right? Especially when you have 59,000 data breaches, okay? So just in, from 2018, from May, right, there were reported 59,000 data breaches. What does that mean? That means in some ways, even though we're deploying, or 47% of the people that we spoke to were deploying multiple times a week, actually we still had data breaches in some of those organizations, right? So even though 47% of it is being done in an automatic way, still there is a gap somewhere that is obviously not allowing us to address some of these security issues. So everyone in this room has a software supply chain. And if you think of your organization as a software supply chain, then it's easier to break up the different silos that you have and understand how to connect them together. And you understand what it means about not passing the defect downstream. A lot of the time, your suppliers are effectively that open source community, right? Everybody in this room has probably some applications that use Java, right? What is the warehouse for Java components? That is Maven Central. Okay. Where are your manufacturers? They are your developers within your team. Whether you have 5, whether you have 10, 200, 1,000, these are your manufacturers. They are putting those components together and they are sourcing them from the suppliers, which are the open source community. Okay? It is very untraditional that developers or manufacturers these days develop software from scratch. That does not happen. The world of reuse is now effectively in play. So demand drives, obviously, releases, right? And in the open source community, there are nearly 15,000 releases per day, right? As an organization, we look at 2 million GitHub projects every day. That amounts to about 120 to 125,000 commits a day on those individual projects. NPM, obviously, is now becoming one of the more common open source repositories, and everyone probably uses AngularJS or some iteration of JavaScript. But that is 5.5 million releases, right? Last year alone, from Maven Central, there were 226 billion downloads. As an organization, we thought that would taper off and maybe slow down. In fact, it increased. The year before, it was 196 billion, right? So this is not slowing down. The use from the suppliers is not slowing down. And your developers are pulling this into your organization. So I talked about Maven Central. Maven Central is a supplier. It supplies open source components that actually, probably 90% of the people in this room will have some backend Java framework, Spring, for example, Apache Struts, that all exists. Now, how do you know whether the supplier is actually helping you or proactively trying to breach you? You don't. Unless you research, obviously, who the supplier is. And that could be another manufacturer, i.e. a developer, sitting in a garage, maybe sitting in the Dedsec Stadium in the coffee shop, right? We don't know. If you think that's a problem, NPM has almost, look at that figure there, that is 2.1 billion downloads of components a day. Every single day, NPM has this number of downloads, whether it's via a build or whether it's via development, whatever it is, okay? 2.1 billion downloads. So 85% or plus of your code is sourced from external suppliers, right? So how do you manage and control or look at the security of 85% of your risk, okay? And applying risk and policies on that, how do you do that? Well, the most important thing, firstly, to understand is not all of those parts are created equal. And it's down to what I was saying before, which was the manufacturers may not be trying to help you or facilitate your development process or help you to become agile and continuously deploy. They may be trying to insert a vulnerability in there that is inherently part of your infrastructure. In 2017, there were 12% of components with known vulnerabilities. Guess what? 2017, there were probably around 150 downloads of components. So developers, even though they may know or not know, were still downloading Java components. What's even scarier is 51% of all NPM components have a known vulnerability. So if you're using front-end, AngularJS, you're going to have a vulnerability in there. It's how you manage that risk. So this is a snapshot from about sort of 5 years ago. This was a sort of transitive dependency tree of Maven Central at the time. This has grown so big, obviously, that I can't represent it anymore. But this is effectively the complex interdependencies of just the Java ecosystem, right? And if we tried to do that against the NPM system, it is a spider's web, right? It is so complex and so dense that you can't actually show it. So what does that mean? When you have 170,000 downloads annually of Java components, actually 18,000 or 19,000 of those have the known vulnerability. That is either documented or undocumented. when we look at NPM, that amounts to, per developer, 60,000 downloads. And obviously that's how we come to the 51,000, or 51% of with known vulnerabilities. So every developer effectively is procurement in your software supply chain. They are bringing these components in, whether you are controlling that centrally or not controlling that. So what's the problem? If the developers continue to develop faster and you want them to move quicker, right, they're going to do that. But they don't have the time to look at security. They simply don't have the bandwidth or the means to understand what they should be looking for. So security struggle with that as well. Because what's the ratio really of security to developers these days? Probably 100 to 1. Now, when an organization continues to do this, right, and developers continue to develop in the way that they are, and the security team tend to enforce in the way that they do, it just becomes habit, okay? And because it inherently becomes habit, everyone thinks it's okay, right? So back to kind of, obviously, the presentation before you heard about going back to the basics, right? Tyson Fury. This is exactly what it is. Going back to the basics and understanding what you are doing and what you are using within your organization. So if everyone is taking security seriously, then you'd think you'd see a downturn in, obviously, breaches, right? Actually, from 2014 down to 2019, there was actually an uptick of breaches, right? An increase by 71%. In 2014, everyone heard about Heartbleed, right? And that was the thing of the time. 2019, that's 1 in 4. Exploits, the time to be exploited has decreased. Why? Because now the attackers, right, have started to get a little bit more complex, right? And started to understand that most organizations do use suppliers. So what's the easiest way to understand how to breach an organization? Go to the suppliers. So now you'll see a lot less organizations being attacked directly, you know, themselves. You're going to see the attackers going to the suppliers. And the suppliers are NPM, Maven Central, PyPy. Okay? And so that time has dropped from what used to be 45 days, right, in 2006 to effectively 3 days. And that's why we have this problem. Right? The ratio is about 100 developers to 1. Okay? The security team just don't simply have enough time to control and govern those policies and those processes. You can't sit over the shoulder of someone and continue to check that they are using the right component. You can't use white and black lists. It just simply doesn't work. Okay? Components change very quickly over time. So what are we trying to do? Obviously, you know, typical software supply chain, right? We developers obviously pull and go to the public OS repositories. This is a very, I would say, you know, a dummy's guide to software supply chain, right? But this is effectively what your software development would probably look like within your organization, right? Everyone sort of understands that. But when you're using a white and a black list, it takes weeks to approve a component use, right? Which effectively stifles your development, right? Stops you from progressing forward. What does that do? May cause resentment in the development team. If you rely solely on red testing, penetration testing, right? What I call perimeter detection, right? You're effectively too late. It's already there. It's within all of your artifact repository. It's in your warehouse. So you want to enforce policies, and that's the point. We want to do this as part of the development process. So security and development should not be two separate points, right? They should be connected. And that is why it's really important to try and manage this across your application lifecycle. Hence the term DevSecOps. So during our survey, obviously we understood that, you know, people that identify these problems quicker save money, right? And 47% of those that deploy weekly, right, or deploy multiple times a week anyway, understand that it's easier to fix those security issues quicker. Typically, you know, the security person's job, right? I have all these developers, I have all these vulnerabilities that I need to look at, right? I have all these different SOC things that I have to, compliance rules, right? How do I manage this? If you don't automate this, you're going to effectively be looking at a wall of sea. Everyone's heard the Equifax story, right? This is 3 days, less than 3 days in fact, of how it was breached, right? And obviously we know what the history of that is now, right? GDPR, security law, policies have improved, fines, BA, right? I could name just a few. Software bill of materials. It gives you a way to identify what is vulnerable within your estate, your application. So by generating these bill of materials, effectively like a supply chain, right? Understanding what is inside of your vehicle, right? Gives you the ability to generate this and understand what risk you have and apply policy on that. And so, even though people do that today with DevSecOps practices, you still have the breaches and you still have the use of vulnerable components like Apache struts. So this is just an idea of some of the vulnerabilities really don't get notified. These don't get pushed onto the NVD. So don't just rely on the NVD. It is not your single source of information, right? It is not the holy grail. There are sources of vulnerability data all over the world. NVD just happens to be the most popular one, and some do not get documented. So what we've learned through our DevSecOps survey is that we've learned that more mature organizations that have practices actually identify that it's easier and it's quicker to solve these problems earlier, right? And obviously it costs less, right? Ultimately, you know, it comes down to how much does this cost the organization. But still today, organizations are not automating this process. You may use things like sonar quality, you may use WAFs, penetration testing, right? There's still, even with that, people are not automating this as part of their pipeline. The goal is to automate quicker, but security just seems to be left at the wayside. So, for me, you know, the software supply chain, if you integrate it and you automate it, it's 2 times more secure, right? As part of your warehouse, manufacturers, and your finished goods. Yeah, this inherently becomes part of the ethos of the team, right? It goes back to the basics about process, how the teams work. And so you don't have the ability to worry and avoid the liability of insecure code, right? And with all of the rising regulations that exist, this is going to become more and more of an issue. And obviously there already exists PCI compliance laws, right? Most banks, most insurance companies, most payment companies have to adhere to this law. There is specifically a section called out for open source software in the PCI compliance. So first thing to do, solve your supply chain problems. Understand what components you use, understand what software you're using. Solve your own quality problems, right? Process problems, automation, and create discipline to do it. So if you haven't already had a look at this, we ran a software supply chain last year. There's some really interesting facts. Some of the stuff that I've used in my presentation today have come from that survey that we've done. So hopefully you've taken away some of the things that really these days matter within application development, right? We are in a software supply chain. We do use open source software. We do not develop software anymore by ourselves. So hopefully you've learned a few facts from that. Do you have any questions? No? Thank you.